Everyone remembers the first time when standing before the intimidating gate in a Zelda game, keeping you and an unknown enemy apart. It's the tense moment of your imagination going wild. What kind of opponent will await you? For me, this moment was Zelda the Wind Waker, and I can firmly remember how anxious I was before the fight. There was no one to beat the first boss for me, and I had to gather my courage and face off what was ultimately a surprisingly feasible fray. After this clash, I was never afraid of any boss fights anymore, and now, after many years, it poses the question of what makes a good first boss. First, we have to settle the purpose of what a first proper boss should try to achieve. Normally, when you're battling against such an adversary, people like to make excuses that it's the first boss, you shouldn't expect too much, the next one will be better, and so on. In a sense, this sentiment sounds logical, since the game has to start somewhere and needs to logically escalate throughout the adventure. Your enemies need to become stronger, more thrilling, and if you show all your cards in the beginning, it's hard to keep the momentum going. In a sense, the first boss is like the first level of a platformer, giving you a tutorial how battles will play out for the rest of the game, and how you should try to figure out their weak points. Take Zelda for instance. Once you figure out that dungeon items are necessary to win against your foe, every following boss can complicate that idea to a certain extent, or even combine tools from previous dungeons with a new one. The purpose of a first boss is to use the basic mechanics you learn throughout the tutorial and contextualize them in a scenario of a fight, a tutorial in a tutorial. At the same time, this also means that first bosses might be designed with being boring on purpose. Clashing against the first Koopaling in a new Super Mario Bros. Title is probably one of the most uneventful confrontations you can imagine, due to how simplistic they tend to be. What's even worse is how they escalate only very rarely, if at all, and there's never the sense of a serious battle. So, while it appears to be the right way to begin on a low and offer more the more the game goes on, it's also plainly stodgy to keep expectations for the first boss in check, because it's the presumably standard. The game that proved this concept otherwise and cemented this theorem of a first, on purpose boring boss was none other than If people are talking about Sonic Frontiers, there's one thing everyone will agree on, despite all its shortcomings: the amazing boss fights. Whereas Sonic Forces only presented lackluster, reused and simplistic confrontations, Frontiers flipped the coin and betted all its rings on the main boss fights. Main boss fights because there are some smaller, more elaborate encounters, but for the sake of argument, let's only focus on the Titans. If you have watched any reactions, nearly every player was flabbergasted by the sheer spectacle the first Titan enemy, Giganto, offered. Transforming into Supersonic during the first boss instead of in the end already set the stakes way higher than ever before, and when the action-packed music kicks in, it's really hard to not be impressed. If people are saying this is only the first boss, you have probably done an amazing job, and it proves that first bosses do not need to be uneventful on purpose to hold back. After all, bosses like Giganto don't even sacrifice accessibility in order for their staging. The Titan gives you a proper taste of how supersonic bosses are going to play out for the rest of the game, so as a result, he still follows the essential rules we established in the beginning. A tutorial does not need to be plain, and it's only up to the creators to find a way to teach in an enjoyable manner. Want to see another good example? Take any Hideki Kamiya game and you will see he doesn't care if it's the first, second or last opponent you come across. In case of the Wonderful 101, the first main boss was the moment I truly fell in love with the game, since it felt like a playable action movie despite being set at the beginning. But there are other ways to make your first proper battle interesting in similar way. Zelda the Minish Cap uses the gimmick of shrinking Link into the size of a mere bug and makes use of that concept brilliantly. When overcoming the first dungeon, a regular enemy, keep in mind the weakest one, squishes itself into the boss room and suddenly takes shape of a massive monster. As normal Link, it would not take more than one swing with the sword short, whereas this version requires a specific strategy to win. The fight itself might not be too varied and certainly lacks in difficulty, but the concept on its own is appealing enough to stick in your memory. Similarly, if your game is narratively driven, you can play with characters and dialogue. The first Paper Mario as well as the Thousand Year Door have excellent first bosses and fumble with your expectations. The Koopa Bros start as a Trojan fake Bowser, and you know this is not all they have to offer. Nonetheless, it adds to the humor of the game despite being quite easy as well. The Thousand Year Door on the other hand builds up the first boss by establishing the dragon's menacing presence multiple times, by showing her aura and letting characters talk about their power. It seems like she's simply too powerful, which is why you find a special badge with the ability to create frog sounds, weakening your opponent as a result and increasing your chances to win. Even so, there's still the dragon's desperate attempt to trick you into a trap, something that is solely based on dialogue instead of gameplay. RPGs operate on different terms just like any other genre, and there's always a way to present your first boss interestingly though. But what about bosses that remain in between? An enemy many followers of this channel should be aware of is Wispy Woods, one of the most iconic Kirby bosses in the series. This tree carries a special reputation of being the first boss in almost every Kirby game, and it's such an established foundation at this point that no one is really thinking about it anymore. It's a Kirby game, of course the first boss is going to be Wispy Woods. Still, why is this tree not as unpopular as the Koopa Links for example, despite appearing way more often? Simply put, the anticipation of what they will do next. I don't think I have to point out how basic a tree is as a boss. Arguably there isn't much you could do with a piece of wood equipped with a stoic face, but the only thing that holds back creativity is your own imagination. I wish to fight Wispy in every following Kirby game because it's always a delight to see what they will do next with a concept like that. Naturally, not every Wispy battle is a creative masterclass of how to design a first boss, but while Giganto is not holding back in spectacles, Minish Cap delivers in an interesting concept and Paper Mario plays with a narrative. Wispy is a special first boss because of reputation. One last way to surprise your audience is the foe itself. In Splatoon 3, the first boss you confront is DJ Octavio, the final foe in Splatoon 1 and 2, mind you. By bringing in your previously arch enemy as a mere first boss, you set the standard already on a different level, and it can only go up from here. If DJ Octavio is the first boss in this game, what kind of opponent will await me for the rest? Of course it builds on the knowledge of previous titles just like Wispy Woods to some extent, but it's not too detrimental to assume some players will have played entries in a massively successful series. As a huge fan of boss fights in general, I really enjoy it if every boss follows a certain standard no matter at which point you fight them in the game. Treat your first boss as the last one, but keep the difficulty of a tutorial in mind, and you have an amazing foundation for an excellent first impression. But what are some exceptional first bosses you can firmly remember, and for what reason? There are many reasons why certain battles stick to our mind, and we can only hope to fight Wispy Woods a million times more.